Your Dog's Friend is a nonprofit 501c3 whose mission is to help keep dogs out of shelters by educating and supporting their humans. We promote positive method of training and behavior modification through stress-free methods. As part of that mission, we offer free webinars like the one you're about to watch. Subjects range from dog behavior, stress-free training, and other tools to help you understand your relationship with your dog. If you like the webinar, be sure to give us a thumbs up. Click the notification bell and subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll be notified when future videos are posted. Now enjoy the webinar.
Welcome to today's webinar, Dog-Dog Conflict in the Home, and we'll be talking a lot about having multiple dogs in the home and what you can do to set your dogs up to succeed. This webinar is sponsored by Your Dog's Friend, a nonprofit 501c3, whose mission is to help keep dogs out of shelters by educating and supporting their humans. Since 2006, we've been promoting the use of positive dog training methods by hosting free webinars just like this one, posting valuable resources on our website, offering affordable dog training classes in person and online, and providing free advice and referrals. We are passionate about our mission, so we hope you will enjoy this webinar and spread the word about Your Dog's Friend. My name is Carrie Hoare. I'm a volunteer with Your Dog's Friend, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Our speaker today is Tanzi Leary. Tanzi is a dog trainer and behavior consultant in the Baltimore County area. She's a Cornell grad and has certifications from the International Association of Animal Behavior Consultants, Pat Miller's Peaceable Paws Training Academy, and Julie Naismith's Separation Anxiety Program. Tanzi focuses on setting dogs and their people up for success through the use of ethical, evidence-based, trauma-informed methods instead of the use of pain, fear, or intimidation. She is more interested in finding ways for you and your dog to live harmoniously together rather than teaching isolated training skills that don't serve a useful purpose for your family. Before we begin, I want to remind you that Your Dog's Friend is a nonprofit, so if you find this webinar helpful, please consider making a donation to help support these free webinars and other free resources that we offer. If you would like to donate, you can visit our website at yourdogsfriend.org and click on the donate button in the upper right-hand corner. We really appreciate your support. Okay, let's get started with today's webinar. I'm sure everybody's really interested. It's a great topic. And over to you, Tanzi.
Thank you. Hey everyone, as I was introduced, I'm Tanzi Leary. I own Dog Crazy Lady, which is in the Baltimore County metro area, and I have owned and operated for coming up on 15 years. And you can see I have a lot of alphabet after my name, and I've had a few others along the way that I've sort of lapsed over time. I've sort of gotten through a lot of the different certifications because I think education is really important. So I want to applaud you and thank you for joining me today to further your own education about dogs. Also, this is a huge topic, and I could talk about dog-dog conflict for 2 days, let alone, an hour. So I'm going to do my best to give you a little bit of a bird's eye view with some useful takeaways if you are in a situation where you have 2 dogs fighting or you think you might add a dog to your home in the near future. But certainly there's a lot more we could cover. So this is just a starting point. All right, so today, Dogs Divided, Preventing and Handling Conflict Between Dogs in Your Home is our topic. Today, I'm going to cover common reasons that dogs are fighting, how I tend to predict outcomes or what information I use to predict outcomes. And that can be useful not only to decide sort of how to take on a situation or go about handling a situation, whether you're going to, spend a lot of time and energy and effort on a trainer and a, vet behaviorist, or you're going to consider rehoming to a friend or family member, or what you need to do. I'm going to talk about how we would introduce dogs in an ideal world if we haven't already found ourselves in a situation where our dogs are fighting, so that we can minimize the chance of conflict. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about what happens if it's too late and the dogs are already fighting. So when people get in touch with me and they say, hey, my dogs are fighting, we start with a consultation to talk about not only the behavior problem that's happening, but I ask a lot of questions. I ask about everything from history, from the moment that dog was adopted, any history we know from before that, medical issues, where they eat, how they exercise, how they sleep, you name it, I ask about it. And I know that sometimes clients have said to me, what does this have to do with our behavior problem? Well, I don't know until I know. So here's why I ask. When you look at this list on the screen, these are sort of the buckets that I can end up putting the problems into by the time I'm finished with the consultation to figure out what's going on and why the dogs are fighting. So let's go through each of these to understand a little bit more what I'm talking about. Medical and grooming issues are one of the biggest problems that I run into when I'm talking to people. And what I mean by that is it could be the kind of situation where we have an older dog and a younger dog. The younger dog is signaling to the older dog, and the older dog's vision isn't that great, and they just don't see the signals. So the young dog is super frustrated because they think the old dog is ignoring and disrespecting, right? But the old dog just has poor vision. I could also have a situation with an older dog that's in pain whenever someone bumps into them because they have some arthritis or some hip dysplasia, and the young dog has no idea and is bouncing off the older dog trying to initiate play. It hurts, right? So the older dog gets upset and snaps. So it could be sort of clear-cut medical issues like that. It could also be a situation where one of the dogs has some discomfort or irritability due to some invisible pain, and they're so irritable that anything is going to cause them to lash out. One of the things that I see come up very commonly is going to be a dental problem, because dental issues are sort of hard to see. They're often under the gums or hidden within the teeth. And it's expensive to do a proper dental with anesthesia. So sometimes people aren't doing those as routinely as we probably should. But dental issues often contribute to a dog's irritability. So addressing that kind of stuff is important. Nails are also an issue. If they're too long and the dogs aren't standing correctly, that can make their hips hurt and their bodies hurt. And when you're in pain, you don't want to play and you don't want to be bothered. So you might get a little snappy. And then I had one really interesting case not too long ago where the dog was very matted. And part of the issue was that there were some handling problems that needed to be addressed as far as the dog's feelings about being brushed and being clipped. But the matting was so severe that the folks actually thought there was also an anxiety issue beyond that because of some of the behavior, and the vet sent them my way. And when I looked at the dog and evaluated the dog, I didn't actually see anxiety beyond being handled. And I ended up working with them until we ended up at another specialist who was a neurologist. And what we found out is that the ears were so deeply clogged with mats and fur that both eardrums were perforated. So no wonder this dog was having so many issues, because grooming was a problem, right? So medical and grooming is one of the really easy things to overlook, and probably the most important. And why is it easy to overlook? Well, when animals are in clinic, they are often really aroused or excited or stressed. And when you are full of adrenaline, you don't really react to different palpations. So it's very hard for the vet to identify discomfort without doing, a lot of imaging, which isn't always on the table. So it's very easy to overlook that stuff. And I would really encourage you to take lots of video of your dogs if you don't already. I know I have tons of video of my animals and keep that as a reference point, because you can check back over time and look for changes in how they move, how they get on and off of furniture and things like that. Okay. The next reason that comes up quite a bit is going to be possessive behavior and territorial behavior, right? So possessive behavior is when I'm talking about a dog who doesn't want to share access to a certain person, or access to food or food items like chews, access to a certain bed, dogs who want to kind of argue about who goes through the doorway to the super fun backyard first, right? Anytime dogs are in conflict over a certain space, person, or item. And if one dog is not willing to defer, that can be one reason that this can lead to conflict. And the other reason it could be a conflict is one dog might be willing to defer, but if the dog who's in possession of the item or person has such a big space around that person that they guard, you may not have a chance. So for instance, I've seen dogs who will guard an entire kitchen from the other dog. So the other dog's out in the living room wandering their way towards the kitchen and gets attacked, but they never had a chance to see any signaling or back off, right? So that kind of possessive behavior issue. With territorial issues, what I'll see sometimes is what we call redirected aggression, where maybe the two dogs are in their yard and a dog walks by on leash outside the yard, and one of the dogs starts barking and lunging at the passing dog and then turns and attacks the other dog that's in the yard, sort of in a release of that, because they just have to be nearby. And that can happen on leashes. or through a window even. So it's really important that we're sort of aware and managing that. We'll talk more about that later, to sort of prevent that instead of leaving everybody unsupervised to hash it out. Friction in general is another reason. This could be issues with play style. Some dogs really like to, chase and run. Other dogs like to, bulldoze each other. And if you have one that likes to chase and one that likes to bulldoze, that's not always a great match. If we have a really old dog and a really young dog, sometimes that is quite a mismatch as well in terms of energy levels and interest. So it can be, really irritating, I think, on a day-to-day basis. So these dogs often will seem okay, and we always say the F word in dog training is they're fine, but then every once in a while they blow up. And so watching for those sort of mismatches is really important, because we might have to do a little bit more work to keep them separated at times so that the dog who's irritated can have some alone time or some downtime, and the dog who maybe needs some different play styles has some other playmates. Cumulative stressors are another area that I look at, and probably if you're attending this webinar, you may have heard the phrase trigger stacking before. Basically, cumulative stress is what we're talking about when we've just had such a stressful series of events happen in a relatively short period of time that when the last thing happens, we blow up, right? And I always like to use a human example for this, from my life, from back years ago when my kids were little and they went to 2 different schools. So if we woke up and one of them overslept or lost their shoe, or whatever it was, now we're running late and I'm hustling them out the door. So I've now, skipped breakfast and we're running to the car, and I get them in the car, but I'm going so fast I spill coffee on my shirt, and I don't have time to change. And then I, run one to school and run the other to school. Because we were late, we were in traffic and it's stressful, right? And I finally get on with my day and I fight traffic back, pick up the other. I never did get to, eat enough food, and I missed my workout and whatever. Everything's gone sort of sideways, but it's not the worst thing, right? But now I'm home, everybody's doing their homework and there's some crying over math, whatever. And my husband walks in the door and says, "What's for dinner?" And I say, "Chicken." And he goes, "Again?" Slap him with my spatula, right? It's not so much that question was the worst, right? Maybe it was a little irritating, but it was the last straw, right? And this happens for our dogs too. And when we think of cumulative stress for dogs, we need to think about it from a dog's perspective, right? So stressors for a dog could be as simple as the Amazon guy showed up, or the dog from next door was loose and staring at me through the window, or the dog, that I saw on the walk today barked and snarled at me, or I went to the vet yesterday, right? It could be all kinds of things that are a little bit, kind of boring to us, so much that they don't even register on our scale of interesting things. But for our dog, they were kind of a big, so we need to pay attention to that. New stressors are also a huge area. And a lot of times people are calling me about the new stressor, and then the dog fight is sort of secondary to it. So what I mean by that is maybe someone's had a new baby, or they've had an older adult move into their home, a parent. Maybe they've moved homes entirely. Maybe their routine has changed. They used to be work from home and now they're back in the office and their whole schedule is different and the dogs are fighting, but they didn't really link the two. Right? So a whole new stressor in the environment can also just be a cumulative stressor, but in a long-term chronic way. So now the dogs don't get along. And you'll notice as I'm talking that some of these things have overlap. It's pretty common that the dogs that are coming to me fit into more than one of these categories, right? And then last but not least, humans have inadvertently made things worse over time. And this can happen in a few different ways. Right? Sometimes the new dog comes in and it's just so exciting to have a new dog, especially a puppy, that the attention really shifts. And the dog who has been our dog for a while is really confused about the new schedule and all of the attention that the new dog's getting, and how arrangements have. It could also be that everything is fine until the dogs fight and then we kind of freak out, right? And I understand all the reasons why we freak out. It's sort of hard not to. But we have a tendency to freak out by yelling and really losing our cool. And so not only are we being loud, but we smell really weird to our dogs in that moment, I think. And so we teach the dogs that when they're upset, we make it worse, right? So one of the dogs might start to perceive that, hey, when that dog walks in the room, my mom or my dad gets really weird, right? particularly if we get, to a point where we lose our tempers and have ever done anything, maybe not so great that we feel bad about, we can do better, right? And I'm going to go through some options today for what we can do. All right, before we get into that, I'd like to kind of explain how I think about predicting outcomes. So once I've done the consultation with folks and I'm going to start talking to them about what are we going to do about it, these are the kinds of things that I am considering, because not every client is going to be a great fit for this kind of training. Right? So one, do they have the time and the budget, and do they have the maturity and interest to work on this? Because this is typically long-term work. We're not going to resolve this in 2 sessions, right? They're going to be with me for at least a couple of months, maybe even longer, depending on how serious the situation is. And it's not necessarily that I have to be there every day, but there's going to be some long-term support typically. And not every family is in a position to do that. And that's okay, right? No judgment from me. But if that's the case, we need to talk about other options, whether that might be rehoming one of the dogs to a friend or family member, even temporarily while we figure things out, or how we get ourselves to a position we can work on things, or can I get them some DIY resources that are, really great because maybe they don't have the budget, but they have the time and the interest, right? So we have to kind of know what we're working with. Next, I have to consider, are there vulnerable people in the home? Are there babies? Are there toddlers? Are there folks who are elderly, or who have any, intellectual or physical disabilities that make it dangerous for them to be near a dog fight, right? Because that can be a really dangerous thing. So we need to take that into account. We also have to consider the idea of, when we put in our safeguards to prevent fights, how good are all of these people at their various levels of age and maturity going to be at remembering to do all of the things that we've asked, right? Because it's very easy to overlook, closing a gate or closing a door. And it's not really fair to put that burden on young children, for instance. I also don't want, a 12-year-old who could be very mature alone with 2 dogs who might fight, right? I need to keep everyone's safety in mind. I also look at, how well is everybody coping? Are the humans and dogs currently handling things okay, or any one of them so stressed that continuing on in this situation, even if we make it a little bit better, is going to be overwhelming for them? And if that's the case, we have to talk about what our options are before we start. And there could be a lot of different options, but I don't want to overlook that when we talk. And I don't want you to overlook it if you are living in a difficult situation with your own dogs. The level of damage is also really important. You might hear something called the fight-bite ratio is something that a trainer might talk about with you. And what we're talking about there is, have there been 20 fights but no actual damage? It's just a lot of noise? Well, I'm not so worried about that, right? Have there been 2 fights and the second one led to an ER visit? That one I'm pretty worried about, because it is very unlikely that if there's another fight, the damage is going to decrease. Right? So if damage is really serious, this is a pretty high stakes scenario. How that damage gets created has a lot to do with the age, size, sex, and number of dogs, right? If I have 2 dogs fighting and one is much larger than the other, that's a pretty high risk of damage to the small dog. If I have 2 dogs fighting and one is elderly and frail, that's a pretty high risk of damage to that dog, right? When we look at dogs who are already fighting, some research has shown us that female-female pairings are among the most difficult to resolve, no better than a coin toss. Now, that's not to say that 2 female dogs can't live together, but what they've studied is that if 2 females are fighting, that is more difficult to resolve than a male and a female, and a male and a male. How much time has elapsed? Did the dog fight happen yesterday and they called me the same day, or did the dog fights start 2 years ago and they called me today because it's finally come to a point where they can't handle it, right? It's going to be a lot harder for me to work on something that's been going on for years. I also want to know if the dogs ever get along, right? Are these dogs that play in the yard fine and go on walks fine, but they fight over one thing? Well, that's really specific and a lot easier to resolve than 2 dogs who never get along. And in fact, years ago, I worked with this very sweet lady who lived in a home that was completely separated by doors and gates in every room, because her dogs were so scary to her when they fought that she would literally hide in the closet until it was over. Interestingly, the dogs have never done damage to each other, but it just really freaked her out. So she had them completely separated at all times because you never knew when they were going to fight from her perspective. So we worked together to sort that out. The next thing I consider is genetic predisposition, right? We have any dogs that genetically might have a tendency to be more likely to do some resource guarding, which on my client list, those are the golden retrievers and the corgis, or who are really game to fight other dogs. And boy, do I have a lot of Frenchie pairs that I've worked with over the years, right? And I'm not going to say that every Frenchie's going to fight and every golden retriever is going to guard. However, if I have a situation where dogs are fighting and one of them happens to be one of those breeds, it's going to occur to me that that may be more of a predisposition than simply environmental. Next, those medical issues I talked about, can they be resolved, right? It's one thing to have some, dental work done and teeth feel better, or to have some arthritis and we can give some anti-inflammatories and feel great. It is another thing to have sensory or cognitive issues. A lot of my older dogs with some, cognitive dementia issues, we can't resolve that, right? Or dogs with long-term issues that cause them to smell differently. I've worked with a couple cases where one of the dogs was very ill with a long-term chronic illness, and the other dog started fighting with them as soon as they got sick. The smell of the dog is different. Something is between them that the dogs are aware of that the people can't see. And it's quite difficult to handle those scenarios if we can't resolve them. Are there resources that are difficult to control, right? Way easier to control bones and shoes and bowls of food than it is to control humans or entire spaces. The dog says, that's my room or that's my couch. It's a lot harder. And then finally, can I do any training around other behavior issues to resolve these problems a little bit, right? So in the case of the dogs barking through the fence at the passing dog, if I work on that problem, can I resolve some of the issues with the fights in the home? Because that's sort of what's spurring it, right? So a lot of times there can be something like that. If I have two dogs who are fighting as they go through the door to the backyard, what if I taught them both, wait at the door until you're released, right? So we can release one at a time. Well, now we're not competing. So maybe we reduce friction there a little, right? So I look at all of these issues and discuss them with the clients before we proceed to decide how big of a deal is this going to be. Okay, so let's pretend we are in an ideal scenario where we are thinking of adding a dog to our family. We have not done it yet, so we can do the most careful introduction to prevent issues from happening. A lot of you may have heard of parallel walking. A lot of trainers recommend that, and I like that too, but I like to start with a follow the leader walk. So I want two handlers, two dogs. If we have more than two dogs, we're going to need more handlers, and we'll do two at a time until we've done everybody. But we're going to go to a big field. I like to use a ball field if I can. And we're going to have one dog way out ahead of the other. And we have to have some kind of landmark. So I might say to my client, okay, you're going to start at that tree, and then you're going to walk to the next big tree right down there. And when you get there, you're going to stop, you're going to reverse, and then you're going to walk back the way you came, right? So I'm following you, and then we're going to turn and you're following me. This allows the dogs to follow each other from behind, which I think is very non-threatening for most dogs. And they get a chance to smell the trail a little bit on the way. So we walk, we reverse. Now we go to our parallel walk. How far apart are we? Famous dog trainer answer, it depends. In an ideal world, we're like across the street distance, which most dogs are pretty comfortable with. If we need more than that, that's fine. We could be 30 feet, 50 feet. If we need more than 100 feet, I have my doubts about this pairing. And in fact, if one of these dogs maybe isn't quite comfortable enough to be around other dogs, in a home yet. So I want to be working with the trainer if the distance is quite extensive. But when we're parallel walking, it could just be that we're parallel walking. The dogs are sniffing and enjoying themselves. I could also add a little game like Look at That, if you've ever heard of that one. If you haven't, I don't have time to go into it today, but it's really easy to search around for online and on my website and the blog. But it's basically a game where we pair the sight of something, in this case a dog, with delicious food. So our dog notices the other dog and we feed them a little bit of chicken, something delicious, so that we, one, create a happy association with looking at the other dog, and two, start to teach our dog that when you see another dog, looking back at your handler is a great idea. So it sort of takes the focus off the other dog a little bit and allows us to keep moving. There are lots of other things you could do, but that's just an easy one you could throw in. But as we're parallel walking and things look comfortable and relaxed, we're going to gradually narrow the distance between the two dogs as long as they continue to stay relaxed, right? You could end up, I don't want to say shoulder to shoulder, but walking somewhat side by side as if you already knew each other and were on a walk if the dogs are comfortable. It may not happen in one day, but in an ideal world, it can. So it really depends on the dogs. My big tip is also a famous trainer tip. If you think you're going too slowly, slow down, you're probably rushing. So now that we've done all that, next ideal step is I move to an enclosed outdoor area like a yard. Sometimes if people don't have a yard, we can borrow one from a friend or a family member. Sniff Spot is out there renting yards by the hour, but I believe they have changed their format a little bit. So you might have to have a membership. If you don't, that may not be ideal. I've had a couple clients use a horse arena at a nearby farm that was willing to entertain us and rented us the arena for an hour. But there's a few different options out there. You just have to be creative sometimes. But first thing you want to do is tidy up that space. And then we're going to let one dog in at a time on their own to explore. If it's your house in your yard, what we want to do is have the visitor dog, the new dog, go in there first alone. And your resident dog is going to be somewhere else, out on a walk, in the car, in the basement, but not there watching. When that visitor dog is finished sniffing and sort of gets tired of sniffing, which usually is in a few minutes for most dogs, you're going to go ahead and remove them and bring your normal resident dog back in and remove the other dog. The yard's going to smell interesting to your resident dog because the visitor dog went and laid scent all over the place. All right, so you're giving them each a chance to explore. Now we've got both dogs out of the yard again, and we're going to go back in with the visitor dog to the far side on leash. And we're going to bring our resident dog in next. If it's a neutral area, it doesn't really matter who goes in first. And we're going to parallel walk again. This should be really quick because we already did this a whole bunch, right? So this should be old hat and it shouldn't take long. As we narrow our distance and we're ready to greet, we're going to keep leashes loose and low. That way the dogs can signal. A lot of times I see people when they greet with dogs, particularly you'll notice this out on walks, they've really choked up on short leashes because the dogs are dragging them. And what happens is the dogs are leaning forward into almost like an offensive stance and they're staring at each other and they're really amped up. And so now it's almost like, we're just waiting for something to explode. So we want the leash to be really low and loose so the dogs can signal in an appropriate way. Keep it really brief so that you don't get nervous. Call them back. And if it looks pretty relaxed and easy, you can drop the leash. This is supposed to be short and sweet. I don't encourage letting dogs play with leashes dragging or harnesses on or anything like that because it is easy to get caught in equipment. This is really just to make sure that there's not going to be an altercation. And if things look good, pretty quickly we want to remove that stuff so everyone's safe. If we have to interrupt, try to keep it cheerful. And we might interrupt just because time has elapsed. It might also be like one's trying to play and the other one looks really like they don't want to. Or if one of the dogs looks like they're getting irritated, often an older dog and a younger dog kind of scenario happens. All right, now, same thing, but we go inside, right? And again, this might not all happen in one day. Tidy up, one dog in, the other dog in. This time when we're both in though, we're not going to parallel walk because we're in the house. We're going to sit down and relax for a little while. I like to do this on leash at first, just to be sure nobody's doing anything weird. But again, this is very conservative. As soon as I think the dogs are really ready to be together, again, leash is loose and low. And at this point, they may be ignoring each other if you've done all this in a relatively short period of time, because they might be sort of over it at this point. And as long as they're loose, I can allow the interaction and be ready to interrupt if I need to. But what I'm not going to do is leave them alone unsupervised or overnight before I've really established that they can be together for extended periods of time. Couple of cautions on that. If you are adopting a dog who just came out of the shelter or just came from transport, I am certainly not doing this on day one. I am going to keep them in separate levels of the house if that's available. If it's not available, separated by doors and gates, and my gates will either be double stacked or I will have blankets and sheets thrown over them to reduce the visual. I'm going to really allow that dog who came out of the stressful situation some time to decompress before I try to start these introductions. I don't have a particular timeline on that, and I know that there are lots of rules of thumb that I think are helpful, like 2-week shutdown or 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months, right? There's all these guidelines out there because they kind of happen that way sometimes, but I think that it's important to really take each individual dog into consideration. And if you don't feel like you know enough about body language to judge that, that's where a really skilled trainer can come in handy. And a little bit of time with the trainer up front can save you a lot of time with the trainer down the road. But letting that dog relax for at least a little while, a few days, a couple, maybe even a week before you start trying to do all these things can be really useful. I never feed dogs in the same room. And the number of times I've had people tell me their dogs fight over food and that they also serve their meals 6 feet apart from each other is a really big number. But I don't feed dogs in the same room. I think it is very easy for dogs to be slightly uncomfortable with other dogs coming near them when they eat. One dog is almost always done eating first and tends to look at or hover around the other dog. And I just find it unpleasant for that dog. So I keep them in separate spaces and I pick up bowls when they're done. Same with chews and puzzles. I do not allow dogs to have chews and puzzles in the same space. I have no problem with dogs being confined briefly while they're working on these things, and I actually use it as part of teaching safe confinement. I'm not a person who's really into crating dogs all the time, but every dog must know how to be crated. They're going to be at the vet one day with some sort of a procedure, and they're probably going to be in a crate or a kennel. There could be an emergency. There's all kinds of reasons why dogs should be able to safely crate. And this is a great thing that you can use as an opportunity for training when you are giving chews and puzzles. The other thing that happens, I mentioned a little bit before about like getting the new puppy and being so into it, we tend to kind of ignore our resident dog because we have this new fun dog and puppy with us. Try not to do that. Try to still carve out time for your first dog because they won't understand. And then finally, as this new dog is settling in, it takes a little while for them to be their real selves because they don't know where they are and they don't know what's happening. So you really have to watch their body language, particularly around spaces, people, objects, and so on. And I'm going to show you some of that body language now. If you have not looked at Lily Chen's work, boy, is she amazing. And she lets us see all of this work online. So I listed her website here as well as her excellent book. And I gave one example of one of her graphics where she has such great stuff out there to give us little pictures of what dogs might look like when they're feeling different ways, right? So I want you to particularly hone in on some of the stressed body language, which includes, the yawning, the lip licking, furrowed brows, things like that. And then, friendly behavior versus play solicitation. Notice in the being friendly section, the dogs are sort of curved and loose. They're not staring at each other, right? That's a pretty typical thing to show friendliness. Dogs that are staring and tense are often not having a great time, but sometimes they'll sort of stare for a second and then one will bounce down into that play bow. So it's sort of hard to know what you're looking at sometimes. And if you're not sure, there's a couple of things you can do. One, of course, you can hire a great trainer to help you watch. 2, capture it on video and watch it back. It can make it a lot easier than trying to watch in real time. And 3, sometimes if you separate the dogs and keep holding on to the one that you thought was maybe being threatening, the other dog, if they were actually being threatened, will usually go away. They won't come back and ask for more. So I always say, if you're in doubt, ask the other dog and they'll tell you. But it's really important to be able to kind of gauge the body language if you have 2 new dogs together. So it's a really great piece of your education if you can check out Lily Chen's work. And certainly there's Dog Decoder is an app that's out there. There's lots of great resources. All right, so now let's dive into why a lot of you are probably here. What if it's too late? You have 2 dogs and they're fighting. What do you do? Let's talk about it. All right, so where do we begin? The first thing that I want you to do is contact a dog behavior expert, right? So that would be ideally a veterinary behaviorist or someone like me, a CDBC. Why do I put this first? Well, most of us are on a wait list and it may be a couple of months before you can see us. So you want to call us before any more days go by and get on our calendars. You can always cancel later if something changes, right? But it's really helpful to get on our calendar as early as possible. Then I want you to schedule that exam with your regular vet, particularly if fights suddenly started between the two dogs, or if you think there could be any medical issues going on, including anxiety. I'm going to step on my anxiety soapbox for just a minute and preach to you that anxiety is a medical issue. It is one that I feel people are uncomfortable discussing about dogs sometimes, where they often feel like dogs shouldn't have anxiety. Because I've specialized in anxiety and aggressive behavior for over a decade, I know very well that many of them are very anxious and fearful and phobic about lots of things. And I genuinely think of anxiety as a treatable medical condition. And what I mean by that is if we have issues with our heart or our stomach or our hip, we're very comfortable talking to doctors about medication and treatment. But for some reason, we want the brain to heal itself, right? And it's just not how it works. So appropriate use of medication when needed can be an enormous change maker for behavior because it gives us the room in the dog's brain to start doing the training in a way that the dog can think, learn, and understand. And if they can't think, learn, and understand because their anxiety is overwhelming, we're not going to go very far with our training. And it could be that the anxiety is separate from the dog fights, or it could be as a result of the dog fights. So it could be something that we consider as a situational short-term issue, or it could be chronic, right? And that's where the skilled vet behaviorist comes in. Possible that your regular vet has skill in that area too. Not all of them do. Most of them will tell you. It's not really fair to think that your vet should be an expert in everything, by the way. If I went to, my regular doctor and said, hey, I'm having anxiety, he'd be like, go see a psychiatrist or a therapist, right? He wouldn't think of himself as the resource for that. But we kind of ask our vets to be the resource, and I think they feel compelled to be the resource. And so it's not that we can't ask them, but we can't expect them to be as nuanced and skilled as someone who does it all day, every day, like a vet behaviorist. The other thing I want to mention is that I think we have a tendency to overlook pain and discomfort in our dogs. One, dogs are great at masking discomfort and pain because animals generally don't like to show vulnerability, I think. And we've done some work to show that dogs can start developing arthritis as young as age 5 and have some discomfort, but they still want to play and walk and do all the things. So we don't really notice it. It creeps up, right? So if you realize that that discomfort could be creeping up, what I'll hear from people a lot is they'll only give pain meds if it looks really bad, if the dog's limping or can't get on the sofa or whatever. And I always think, like, if I had a sore hip or sore knee and I only took Advil when I couldn't walk anymore, I'm sort of doing myself a disservice, right? I need to be a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more proactive in my treatment, or else I'm probably going to decline faster. So I want you to always, put yourself in your dog's paws as much as you can when you make decisions with the vet about how to proceed. Now, the vets are at a disadvantage because when we get to clinic, that adrenaline masks all of the discomfort sometimes. So again, take lots of videos so that you can show, and you want videos of your dog walking towards you, walking away from you, walking across your field of view, and climbing on and off of things if possible. I wanted to list the websites where you can find the folks that I'm talking about. So Veterinary Behaviorist website is listed there, and so is IAABC for CDBCs. There are certainly other qualified trainers and vets out there. Please don't think that I am indicating that there aren't and that you must have one of these qualifications to be worth working with. That is definitely not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is I'm pretty sure that if you work with one of these folks, you will get great help. However, also read their reviews, because a lot of folks who are really, really great with dogs are not so great with people. And you have to be good with dogs and people to do a really good job of training. Let's say you don't have these folks in your area and you are just looking around at other trainers. Just beware of those red flags. There are a lot of trainers out there who are sort of living in the past as far as canine cognition is concerned. They're not really working out of what we know today. So you'll hear them talk a lot about like your leadership or your energy is causing the problem, or who's the alpha. They'll tell you to act like a dog. I've worked with a number of people who work with this one guy in town who's always having people growl at their dogs, which does not work. They know we're not dogs. And of course, using collars, shot collars, whatever you want to call them, stim, e-collar, whatever you refer to it as, choke, pinch, prong, all that stuff. I don't use any of those. I find that they are very suppressive to the behavior, but they don't get underneath the root cause to really shift things internally. It's very easy to shut down behavior. It is not easy to fix it from the inside out. And why do I care? Well, if I just shut it down, I didn't really solve the problem. I've just sort of kicked the can down the road, and it's probably going to be bigger and worse when it finally explodes. Okay, so now I've got my appointments booked. I've got my vet behaviorist if I need one. I've got my vet. I've got my trainer lined up. What do I do now? Well, to prepare for those appointments, what I want you to do is make a list of all the altercations with as many details as possible. Because what we have to do is identify patterns. And if you have compiled all this information, it is going to be so much easier to see what is going on. So I want to know, where were the dogs when the fight happened? Literally where? Living room, kitchen, yard? Where were we? Who else was there? Were there any humans? Who were they and what were they doing? What time of day was it? Did we just come back from a walk? Were we getting ready to go for a walk? Were we about to eat? What's going on? How did the humans react during the fight? Were they yelling? Were they jumping up and down? Did they hide in the closet like my poor client? What's happening in general? Were the dogs like sleeping? Was one dog sleeping? The other dog was walking around? Was there a chew in there? What was going on? Also, what else happened in the last 24 hours or so, right? Were there fireworks last night? Was there a vet visit? Was there a groomer visit? Did we go on a car ride? What else happened that was interesting, exciting, or arousing from a dog's point of view? How did the fight end? Did they just stop? Did someone have to intervene? Right? And then generally, when are the dogs never going to fight, if there is such a time? On walks? In the yard? Sleep? Right? I want to know all these things. And as you go through these lists for each fight, you're going to start to see patterns. If there's only been one fight, you're going to have at least a hypothesis to work from. Occasionally, people come to me and they say, I have no idea. And that's fine. But what I usually find out if we start tracking data is that there is some sort of a scenario happening, and it can usually be boiled down to transitions. So we were getting ready to go on a walk. We were getting ready to come in from outside. We had finished breakfast and we were getting ready to get up and go to work. So times where things are changing and moving, right? So that can be one that's hard for folks to see sometimes, but if you keep track, you will tend to see it. So now that we have all that information, what do we do, right? While we're waiting to see our vet behaviorist and our trainer. Well, we want to control what we can control. Okay, so I put this pot of water about to boil over on here because what we want to think about is all the stuff that is happening is this water in the pot. And I want to do my best to turn down the heat, right? Because the fastest way to stop problems is to turn down the heat. So 1, relieving discomfort and pain. 2, avoiding or minimizing stressors and triggers. Okay? So when I talk about minimizing stressors and triggers, what I mean by that is, let's say my dog is stressed by that Amazon delivery that I mentioned before. Well, could I put on brown noise or rock music in the background and close the blinds or put up window cling on the windows to blur the view so that it's less noticeable when he shows up? My dog has less arousal during the day, so he's not quite as hot, so that last straw doesn't happen when my other dog walks over too close to him, right? If we fight because the other dog is outside and sets us off, could we talk to the neighbor and, have times a day where we agree that we're going out and you're going out? Or could I let the dogs out one at a time for a little while, right? I want to think about how can I avoid problems as best as I can. If I can't avoid problems, how can I separate the dogs, right? So let's say that fights are happening when I'm not home. I don't even know what's going on. Well, the dogs can't be together when I'm not home, because if they keep fighting, they're going to keep rehearsing the behavior. right? So I have to do one or the other. I can't just let it continue. Otherwise, we're going to spin our wheels. Can I make routines really predictable? I find that predictable routines are really soothing to dogs with anxiety, and they're very helpful for dogs that are having altercations because some structure in the day sort of helps them know what to expect. Your behavior is also under your control. If you're one of those people who gets loud and stressed, right, you might have to take a breath. You might have to leave the room, but you have to find a way to control your behavior around the dogs too. Then I'm going to think about my training strategies. And these might be things that you wait to do with the trainer, but if you're going to DIY, these are the kinds of things I want you to think about. Number one, if you do nothing else, emergency recall. Teaching dogs to come to you when they hear a sound, and I don't care if it is a whistle, I don't care if it is the word come or here, I don't care if it is the word treats, but teaching dogs to spin and run to you is going to be such a huge game changer, because if you see friction brewing across the room, you can move them out of it and over to you, and it'll completely change the mood if they go from staring at each other to, yeah, I'm going to get a treat, right? So emergency recall is number one. Next, go to mat with a relaxation protocol. If you haven't heard of a relaxation protocol, there are a few veterinary behaviorists who have created them. Probably the most famous one is Dr. Karen Overall's protocol. It is on my website and on the internet at large. But it's basically a way of teaching a dog a relaxed settle on a mat despite what's happening in the environment around them. So if I have a go to mat with a relaxation protocol, if I've just done an emergency recall and I can send each dog to their own spot and separate them, that is super helpful to me. If I can teach dogs to relax on their mat despite what's happening around them, I can also reduce friction that happens with dogs passing by each other in spaces if that's part of our problem. And it's also helpful if I need to separate the dogs to teach them sort of safe haven ideas where they're going to be in their own space on their mat and they can relax, even if I'm not there paying attention to them. If it's a mismatch situation where I have one dog that maybe has play skills deficit, he's rude or he's really rough and the other dog isn't, I can look to find remedial play sessions with the trainer and a helper dog maybe to improve his play, or maybe I can find him a dog who loves to roughhouse like a bull in a china shop and they can play together, right? So I have to find ways to kind of give him another outlet. But while I'm doing that, I'm also going to work on training him to stop and come back to me. So practicing that emergency recall in that difficult, distracting environment so that I can interrupt before he overwhelms my other dog. I can work on changing associations around specific context. If you have dogs that fight about all the things, I really recommend using a trainer for this because it's just too broad of a category. But if it's something very specific, like the dogs get upset when I'm sitting on the couch and I'm sitting with one and the other one approaches, right? That's a pretty specific thing that I could try to work to improve, to say, when the other dog approaches us, good stuff's going to happen to you. And if you get tense, I'm going to get up and walk away, right? That's a really specific one you could work on. If it's something like, the dogs are fighting over bones and food, I'm going to manage that forever. I'm not going to waste my time training that because it's so darn easy to manage that I wouldn't want to spend hours of time teaching dogs to be comfortable eating and chewing near each other if I didn't have to. It's so easy to put one in another space. I can do training to address behavior at friction points, like that idea I mentioned of waiting at doors until you're released. If it's something where they boil over when we're leashing, so everyone's excited, I could teach being waiting, right? But any kind of training that helps sort of with the issues that are a little bit secondary or that are contributing. And then I also want to plan the safest ways to end fights. I want to think about indoors and outdoors, and I'm thinking of ways without using my body. So ringing a doorbell is my favorite way to do this. You can even have a doorbell sound on your phone, but a doorbell ring will interrupt almost every dog I've ever met and send them running to the door. Now, if your dogs are fighting at the door, don't do this, right? But that is just a sound that can interrupt really well. If we're outside in the yard, I had one client that was using an air horn for a little while, very sparingly. It was sort of an emergency only situation. The dogs would fight over sticks and we kept the yard really tidy, but if one fell out of a tree, it could kind of be like a sudden prize. And so she had one just in case until we resolved that issue. Heavy blankets can work. And it certainly isn't going to work on every scenario, but I have seen a heavy blanket thrown over to fighting dogs sort of startle them into stopping, particularly if they're smaller and it's easy to have those in multiple rooms. A lot of trainers talk about putting a board between the dogs. I personally find that a little bit clunky and difficult. Maybe if your dogs are really small and you had like a large piece of cardboard, but if you have two large dogs, I think that would be really, really challenging. And I'm not really sure how it would work. I haven't personally used that one, but it is advice that's out there. You'll commonly hear to wheelbarrow them, two people, they're each grabbing hind legs. Personally, I've seen that not work very well, where now people are holding hind legs and one dog is still clamped on the other dog. So maybe it works better if they're sort of just snarling at each other. But if one is already grabbed hold of the other dog, that's not going to make him let go. But water is probably the last one, maybe available in the kitchen. Although I think it'd be a really long, slow wait for the pot to fill up with water until you could throw it at the dogs and startle them. Maybe if you're outside and you have a hose. None of these are perfect strategies. I don't think there's an ideal way to end fights. And then people will talk about break sticks, which is something that you can insert between the molars and twist, open the clamped jaw. I've only seen them used in shelter environments. It is much harder than you think to appropriately insert that and turn it with two animals that are moving and fighting. Not something that I would rely on or recommend for the average person. Why do I say avoid using your body? Well, I've done it. The only time I will ever do that is if I have no other choice. One of the dogs is definitely going down because you will get bitten. These are my arms, so you can see the aftermath. It hurt for a couple weeks and I couldn't close my hand, especially my left one, properly for a while, which was unpleasant. But I had a golden retriever and I was in the yard with her because I was letting her out for a neighbor as a favor. And there were two German Shepherds in the adjacent yard who had just gotten let out unbeknownst to me. I found out because everybody started barking. I went to get the golden retriever and she was running back and forth. And the German Shepherds were lunging at the fence. And so there happened to actually be two fences between these yards. I didn't really know all this at the time, but I figured it out as we were going. And her fence was like a split rail with mesh, and their fence was steel, sort of a tall vertical type of fence. But they had jumped at it so many times that it was leaning a lot closer to the golden retriever's fence. So they just caught kind of a lucky moment where she was running past and the large male shepherd grabbed her by the neck. And when he grabbed her, he pulled her through both fences and was just yanking as hard as he could. From my perspective, it looked like he might have her ear. It turned out to be just her neck, but I really couldn't tell. So I was doing everything I could and I was yelling for help. And I yelled until I lost my voice, but no one was coming. The folks in the other house were not out there. No one in the neighborhood was walking or biking. There's literally no one in what's normally a busy neighborhood. So I was doing all of the things that I'm going to beg you not to do. I was, punching him in the ribs and in the gut through two fences. I was twisting his ears, poking his eyes. I was trying to pry his jaw open, and it did not work. I could not get him off of her. And finally, someone from inside the house with the shepherds heard the commotion, came out, and it took two of us to open his mouth. And the whole time, the third dog, the other German Shepherd, was lunging at everything. Snarling and grabbing and biting. So by the end, the golden retriever was finally loose, severely injured, two major tears in her neck, ended up with drains multiple times. I was severely injured, but she was alive, right? And I was willing to do it, but I don't recommend it. And, it's one of those things that I don't want for any of you. So having other options in place is really important. And also having two people around when there are dogs loose who might fight is really, really important because I couldn't have done it without this. So hopefully none of you are in that scenario, but I hope that I've given you some information today to help you think about any situation that's happening in your home, or to think about how to select the right dog for your situation and avoid friction and conflict. If you have a situation that you need a little help with, I do offer Zoom consultations to give you some support. I have a lot of free material on my website that's posted here in the blog section that you are welcome to make use of. And if you have trouble finding someone reputable in your area, I have a pretty big trainer network, particularly on the East Coast. And I'm always happy to see if I happen to know a colleague in your area. All right, so let's find out what questions we have today.
That was fantastic, Tanzi. Lots and lots of information.
Thank you.
I've got a few questions. Let's see. We've got one on, we mentioned crates, and we've got one from a person who said they saw an argument a few days ago from a trainer about not crate training because it's not a necessity. Listed reasons why not, and refuted the vet emergency point by saying that dogs won't necessarily be able to generalize the crate training between environments, especially during the stress. So she would like your thoughts on that.
I agree that dogs don't always generalize. I think that I can only, I can never be psychic and know how a dog's going to feel, but I would think the first time that I'm ever confined, if I were also in a clinic and in pain, maybe with IVs run, things like that, it would just be worse, right? So I just tend to feel like some experience with confinement and being separated from my very favorite people is better than none. You know, I guess we can, in the dog training world, you always say if there's 3 trainers in the room, there's going to be an argument, right? Everyone has different opinions. I don't crate my dogs either. I've always been a person. I sleep with puppies from the night they come home. I use X pens to give a lot more space. I do crate training strictly for emergencies and vet visits. And it's really to make sure that my dog isn't going to be in a crate injuring themselves to escape, right? Because some dogs, the first time they're in a crate, will panic and bleed, breaking claws and teeth trying to get out. And I would really hate to find out that that's how my dog's going to react the first time at the vet. So I would say I would kindly disagree with that trainers on that. But I agree with them that I don't think dogs need to be crated all the time. Dogs in Europe don't crate for the most part. I think we rely a little bit too heavily on confinement to manage dogs for our convenience instead of thinking about their comfort.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the perfect answer. I think the same answer for should I muzzle train my dog? I personally think every dog should be muzzle trained simply so that if they're hurt or injured, they're going to get muzzled. And so we don't want that to happen for the first time during a stressful situation.
Definitely not. It just makes it worse. And, I was in a vet clinic, I want to say last summer, and I was dropping off donuts. I was just dropping off donuts. And I happened to see this lady come in with her enormous Labrador and wouldn't get out of the car. So she was in the parking lot and she was like crying. And I was like, what's wrong? She's like, I can't get my dog into the vet. And of course I was like, want some help? So I got the door open to the clinic and I got the lobby cleared out and I got the, door open for the dog and I got the dog into the clinic and then got him into the exam room. And I was like, cool, can I leave? And then as I walked out, the vet was like, do you think you could muzzle that dog? And I was like, oh, seriously? I'm back with I was like, do you have any easy cheese? And he was like, no. And so I went out to my car, I happened to easy cheese. And I taught the dog very quickly in like 10 minutes to put a muzzle on. And we put the muzzle on. That was not ideal. It's really not the way to do it. And they were lucky that I was there and that I had time, but that's not the best way to do it.
Yeah. I think that there is some memory built there if you do both of those things often enough and it's got a really good association with it, that dogs are going to remember that muzzles and crates are okay.
Yeah, I can't see where
even if you don't use them regularly, if you're just using them as a training tool.
Yeah, I don't think you could make it worse for sure.
Yeah. So someone asked about experience with coverage from pet insurance for a dog behavior consultant. If you're working like with a veterinary behaviorist and they want you to work with a VB or a CDBC, do you know anything about how that's covered on pet insurance?
Yeah, I frequently submit letters with invoices to insurance companies for clients. My understanding is that you have to have the behavior coverage before the behavior issue crops up. It's not something you can tack on later. So when you're selecting your plans, I think that's something to look at. But typically they get quite a bit of coverage. I know one of my clients was a separation anxiety case, not an aggression case. And he's a very sweet guy. So like, don't take this the wrong way, but he had a dog that we had just resolved the situation. Then he got a second dog that also had separation anxiety. So we had to
Oh
start all
no.
over again. So it ended up being a $5,000 case over a course of a year and a half, and insurance covered the whole thing. So, there's quite a bit of support and coverage as long as you have the right plan. Do I know specifically which plans those are? Not really, because they seem to change pretty frequently, and I just honestly don't keep on top of it, but they definitely are out there.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's one of those, it depends, and I would contact the insurance company directly and ask them how it's covered. I know I've also heard with some of the veterinary behaviorists that have come on Your Dog's Friend, that they have had luck with prescribing
Mhm.
a behaviorist. It all really all depends on how your coverage works. So I think the best thing is to directly ask your insurance. Let's see. Do you work with cats?
So years ago, way back, I worked at the Maryland SPCA. So I did learn quite a bit about cat behavior then. I would not consider myself a cat expert, but I often work with dog cat scenarios. And if it's just cats, I'll tend to refer out to one of the excellent cat behavior specialists in town. If it's dog cat, we sometimes partner up. But there are a number of cat specialists out there who are certified cat behavior consultants if you do have cat issues specifically.
Yeah, and I will say I'll share the ABC has a page on their website where you can actually look up by where you are located in the world to find consultants, and then you can look to see if they cover cats.
Yeah, and cats, honestly, most of those folks work on Zoom, so it doesn't matter where they are. They can help, get someone in your time zone, I think is more convenient, but
Mhm.
they work on Zoom quite a lot.
Yeah.
And dog trainers work on Zoom too. Everyone sort of doubts it until they try it, but it works really well because I'm not there being super distracting to the dogs. Dogs are not going to act like their normal selves when I'm around.
Yeah. Let's see. Any suggestion for dogs that have broken out of crates multiple times when left alone? Only when left alone.
Yeah, so that's probably a dog where I would have camera running for sure, because what my main concern would be is this a dog that has some underlying separation or isolation anxiety that is exacerbated by confinement? The body language is going to tell me the story on that. Or is this a dog that just is bored and doesn't want to be confined? But in general, if a client comes to me with something like that, my first question is, why are we confining, right? Is it because the dog is destroying things? Is it because we think we should? What's going on? And a number of times, I've been surprised because the clients are like, well, I don't know. Like, what happens if we leave the dog alone? I'm afraid to find out. Okay. So what we do then is we set up scenarios where we leave with cameras running for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, where we come right back, right? More often than not, if I hear a dog is breaking out of a crate, we are dealing with some level of separation or isolation anxiety. And the confined space just makes it worse. I mean, imagine any scenario where you're frightened or stressed and now you can't move, right? It's just worse. So that is 99% of the time going to be a situation where we're talking to a veterinarian about long-term anxiety medication and working on desensitizing the dog to brief periods of alone time. Julie Naismith is someone who's worked quite a bit in that field. Milena DiMartini as well. They have a lot of online resources that you could check out, but we're probably going to have to stop breeding because the dog's going to injure themselves eventually. We'll have to think of alternative scenarios.
Let's see. Will dog aggression get better once my dogs are older? I have 4 dogs, all under 6 years old. 2 are resource guarders and will attack. I've been bit on a number of occasions trying to separate them. So do dogs get better as they get older?
Not really. I wish I wish I could say yes. No, they might get slower. They might not if they stop to seeing each other, maybe. But no, not usually. I find that actually behavior can get worse over time because they get more irritable, their bodies hurt more, they don't see as well, so they're a little more anxious. If it's resource guarding in particular, I find that resource guarding is one of my favorite things to train because it has a really high likelihood of success if you do it carefully and well. So what I would tend to do in that scenario is try to figure out how to address the resource guarding with each dog. So, because if it's happening and directed at you, that's a lot easier to manage and train than when it's directed at another dog. So I would sort of work with that first. But also, when we have that many bodies in one space, there's often friction that we're not seeing because we can't be everywhere at once. So I would really want a good look at all of the moving parts. And there's often a really good chance that at least one of these dogs is experiencing enough anxiety that we might be talking to the vet about meds. There's maybe some breaks that need to be had. Maybe one of the dogs needs alone time part of the day, right? There's a lot of different things we can do without knowing all the details. I can't give you very specific recommendations. But no, I generally don't think dogs grow out of their feelings. If anything, I think they get better at practicing.
Let's see. Do you offer seminars specifically for shelter staff?
I have done them. I'd be happy to set something up if you want to reach out to me for sure. When I was at SPCA, I used to teach there all the time just because I was on staff. And then after I was not staff, I came back and taught quite a bit. I'd be happy to talk with you about something like that.
The next one is, do you have tips for resource guarding that only happens with other dogs, not with people?
So I think it's important to figure out, what the resources are and can they be managed, right? So if we're talking about items, which it's, a lot of times I walk into people's houses and they'll say, yeah, the dogs fight over things. And as I walk through, I'm like, there's a stuffy, there's a shoe, there's a bone, let's pick those up, right? So one, making sure the space is sort of managed. Two, if it's conflict about moving through spaces, I might look at some relationship building, more, can we encourage the dogs to play and walk together, things like that? Because if we're struggling to walk down a hallway together, maybe it's a little more, maybe the resource is just the thing that makes us blow up. Maybe there's more friction than just that. If it's around a person, I'm going to do training specific to what happens in terms of predictions. If the person is with dog A, what happens when dog B approaches, right? I'm going to, really try to train specifically around that if I can. So again, without the details, it's hard to say exactly what I would do, but from a general perspective, I'm going to manage the environment to prevent friction. I'm going to reduce all other stressors so that we have less cumulative stress throughout the day, even if they're not related to the dog fights. I'm going to do as much training as I can. That particular scenario, that relaxation protocol I mentioned might be a great one for each dog so that they learn to relax in each other's presence, right? So, again, it depends, the great trainer answer, but you want to look at the whole picture and control what you can control.
I missed Amy. Sorry about that. She says we have 4 dogs. 2 females fought in May. External stimuli, thanks for neighbor's dog running along our fence line. The new dog was adopted in February. This was the instigator, had been fine with everyone up until this instance with the dog running along the fence. Do you find that dog-to-dog aggression transfers to the other dogs not involved in the first fight in the future?
Not really, unless it's that redirected aggression that I talked about, where I'm so frustrated that I lash out at whoever's nearby. If I have fence issues, and by the way, this is what I actually recommended to that neighbor with the golden retriever next door to those German shepherds. I like to put up visual barriers. So you can buy a privacy screen from Lowe's. You can plant landscaping if you want more of a long-term solution, but it is a little bit more expensive. But I'm going to put something opaque along that fence line to reduce the visual stimuli for sure. Landscaping is cool because it also widens the distance between the dogs so that there's no or limited risk of jumping over it, right? But I'm going to try to minimize that. I'm also going to spend time recalling away from that dog if I can, if the neighbor is willing to let me do some counter conditioning where I'm tossing treats over the fence at their dog while I'm working with my dog. I certainly will do that too. But it's going to be tough with 4 dogs because there's always going to be a chance that some other external stimuli is also a problem, right? That just happened to be the one that was the problem in this scenario, but it could be another one. So that would be another case where I would really look carefully at all the friction that happens throughout the day and the week and make sure that there aren't other stressors I can also reduce. Because if it just takes one last thing to set everybody off, usually there's other things.
Yeah, she mentioned they did put a screen barrier along that side of their fence. They told the neighbor to stop letting his dog come to our fence. The other thing I was thinking, you mentioned landscaping as a barrier. You can also put up like a temporary, you could use chicken wire or snow fence, or even depending on how big your yard is, an X-pen a couple feet away from your fence into your yard to create that neutral zone. So it's hard to control what the neighbor's doing with their dog, letting their dog come to the fence, but you could stop your dog from getting right up to the fence by putting in a second barrier and having like a neutral zone there.
Yeah, it's hard. The neighbors that I was talking about on my side where I got nailed, they ended up having a deal where I think like the German Shepherds don't go out from like 12 to 2. And they have some timeline that they agreed on that's, always like a German Shepherd free time, which I think is, hard. But, sometimes it can't be controlled all day long, but maybe there's some window of time that's convenient too.
Yeah, if you have a good relationship with the neighbor, you could do something like a little flag that goes up when a dog is out and down when the dog is not out. Easy way, or putting a bandana on a fence post even, just a visual sign that you can look out and see if their dogs are out. But I think that's another instance where, as Tanzi mentioned, a really good recall comes in handy too. Calling them away from the fence. Does anybody have any other questions that they'd like to ask? Here's one. The only time my dog fights with my parents' dog, which thankfully they don't live together, is when my dog vomits. Uncontrollable IBD and inflammation. She has severe resource guarding, and I'm not sure how you fix it.
Plenty of dogs guard their vomit, which is what I'm assuming is happening, and the other dog's interested. And it's kind of an interesting thing, to say, who's at fault here? Technically, I would blame the dog who's trying to come eat the other dog's vomit because it is rude. If you're the dog who has the resource, the bone or the chew or whatever, or the vomit in this case, other dogs should socially be aware that it is not appropriate to approach you to that close proximity and read your signals and back off. Right? Now, if you're guarding an entire room, you're inappropriate. Your guarding is off the charts, right? So I would actually be a little bit more likely to try to work on teaching the parent's dog to defer. This is not easy, but I've done it in some scenarios where, like this, where there's no other choice. And the way that I did it, this is going to go off the kind of like dog trainer esoteric territory for a second, so bear with me. I tend to use a constructional approach, which basically means that I like to have 2 skilled handlers, so me and usually an assistant trainer with the dogs. And we would set up the dog who's vomiting with something else, since we're not going to induce vomiting, right? So some high value resource, pile of food, lick mat, whatever. And we would bring the other dog into the space at an appropriate distance. And we would watch for any signal from either dog of relaxation or kind of no conflict, right? So I'd be watching for some sort of deferent signal from the dog that I approached, and I'm holding him on a leash, right? So maybe he drops his tail a little, maybe he looks away, and now he's going to get rewarded, in that case, with his own treat, and we're going to move him away. So now we have let the dog who has the lick mat relax because the other dog moved off, right? So we're basically trying to show each dog that we don't need to have a conflict when there's this sort of scenario present. It's really hard to do though, and you need multiple skilled people. So that is a tricky situation where I might sort of say, limit their times together. Do I have an amazing recall on the other dog to move them away because the dog that's vomiting and sick is probably not the one to try to move at that moment? Do I have the ability to train that dog since it's my parents' dog? I would probably try to run through some creative list of ideas to figure out how to handle that scenario.
There is one more question here. Any tips for dogs that will be together for a short time period, like a vacation week, introducing some new dogs to the extended family?
Yeah, so going back to that kind of introducing dogs series of slides, that's how I would begin. What I find that most people do is just sort of like open the door and all the dogs pile into the room and then somebody flares up and now we have a problem, right, for the rest of the weekend. So starting off with that idea of, what could we do to arrange walks? And if you're all vacationing, you might not know where can I go. So you might have to scope that out in advance. Is there a ball field that we can use? Is there a fenced area anywhere that we could use? What can we do? Can we do something on long lines if we can't find a fenced area? What are our options, right? It may not be perfect. I sort of laid out what I think is an ideal plan, but as we know, things are not always ideal. But if you kind of try to start a little bit slowly, I think a little extra time spent on day one will end up being a much easier trip for everybody than kind of a blow up on day one and everything's stressful. I would also have my emergency game plan of what if these dogs do not get along? How are we keeping them separated? Which dogs are able to be confined in a separate room? How are we going to keep them entertained? What are we going to do when everybody has to go out to the bathroom first thing in the morning? Who goes first? How are we doing it? So I would sort of just spend a little time planning in advance so that everything goes smoothly. And the vast majority of the time, clients end up in this scenario all the time with me. Either they're going on a trip or someone's coming to visit. We spend a lot of time planning and everything actually goes really well and it's not a problem. It's when we spend no time planning that things usually.
Could you repeat the name of the relaxation protocols?
Sure. So probably the most famous one that you'll find the most online resource for is Dr. Karen Overall's relaxation protocol. I have a page, I don't know if what YDF has, and you can maybe share more, but on my blog, if you go to the very top post is called the Video Refresher Library, and it's an alphabetical list. And if you go down to relaxation protocol, I have an entire page of relaxation protocol resources that you could use. Another good one is out of Texas Vet Behavior. Dr. Laura Haug has a great relaxation protocol. I think Suzanne Closure wrote one at one point, but there's a few out there. I always say, listen, these are not magic protocols; they are guidelines. And so as you're doing them, none of them feel perfect. I have quibbles with all of them that I would love to someday be like, why'd you put that in there? Or why didn't you do it this way? They're just a nice starting point for teaching. So once you get the hang of it, you can kind of make it your own. And I frequently ask clients, as we go through the protocols, there are these scenarios where you teach dogs to be relaxed no matter what's happening around them. But what we will do is pick some of the things in the scenarios that their dogs don't care about and substitute in things their dogs do care about. So we sort of customize problems. So for instance, if the protocol says the dog is relaxing on a mat and the human takes 10 steps across the room and back, and the dog doesn't care about that, my protocol might say, okay, whenever we get to those, instead, the dog is on the mat, the human is sitting nearby, and someone else walks the other dog across the room and back, right? So I'm going to take the basic framework and start with that so the dog understands the game, but then I'm going to customize it for the problem that I'm trying to address.
Excellent. I think that's the last of the questions. These have been some really good questions too today. Tanzi, again, thank you so much for presenting. This was excellent, great information. And way to address the big topic. This is a huge one. So
I know
way
I
to
could
go.
come back for 2 days and talk about this forever, but
Yeah.